Lenin's real name was Ulyanov. He came from Simbirsk, a small provincial town on the Volga. He was born in this frame house, 1870. His father's diligence and public spirit had rewarded him with the office of Director of Education for the region. His mother was an intelligent and serious woman who, like his father, had been brought up in the middle-class tradition of plain living and high thinking. At the age of 4, Lenin posed with his sister Olga, and at the age of 9, he took his place in a family portrait. His report card proved his diligence. Full marks for everything. His favorite brother Alexander was arrested for plotting to assassinate the Tsar. In the prison fortress of Schusselburg, he was executed. Lenin, 17, swore revenge. The family now moved north to Kazan, and it was here that Lenin first read the words of Karl Marx. In this kitchen, he developed a basis for the socialism which remained the driving force behind the rest of his life. A year later, the family moved once more south to Samara, and here Lenin started secretly to convert his friends to Marxism. It was while he was at Samara that the province suffered one of the chronic famines which swept across the landscape like a plague. The leading liberals worked anxiously to relieve the sufferings of the peasants, but Lenin refused to join them. For the first time, he demonstrated the steely purpose of the practical politician. He argued that the famine was a direct product of the social structure, but as long as society remained unchanged, there would continue to be famines. This fact, he said, would cause the peasant to think about the society he lived in and begin to blame the social order for his condition. Faith in the Tsar and Tsarism would be destroyed. There would be disturbances, and this would threaten the entire order of society. And this is why the well-to-do really wanted to relieve the suffering of the people. In 1895, after visiting Switzerland to meet the leading Russian socialists in exile, Lenin settled in St. Petersburg. For a time, the Russian police failed to catch him. He studied law, but most of his time and energies were devoted to the revolutionary underground. He occasionally wrote his mother, asking for a little money as his funds ran low, and tried to amuse her with accounts of a nagging landlady and a particularly persistent balalaika player in the next room. In fact, life was uncomfortable, and his file in the records of the secret police was growing fatter. He escaped them several times, but in the end, his capture was inevitable. Lenin was arrested in Christmas week of 1895, and he spent 14 months in prison without trial. He did exercises to keep fit, and remembering his use of invisible ink as a schoolboy, he smuggled out pamphlets and instructions to his friends. Then, at the age of 27, he was exiled to Siberia. For Lenin, Siberia was easily endured. He had his own house and time to hunt and skate and walk and argue and think. He learned to be patient and to use Siberia as a training ground for revolution. However, he was lonely and thought a great deal about a fellow exile and comrade, a young woman named Krupskaya. He proposed marriage, and she accepted. In the spring of 1899, the authorities gave permission for the marriage. For the two young revolutionaries, it was an idyllic time. They were young and in love. After their honeymoon, they settled down to a translation of the trade union history. And Lenin launched a new project. He had been planning the publication of a new revolutionary paper, and now it appeared. It was called Iskra, the spark. It was now that Ulyanov began to sign himself Lenin. Iskra was published in Germany and smuggled into Russia. Then the nervous German printers forced it to move to England. Lenin and Krupskaya, now released from exile, also moved to England, to a very foggy London. They rented 2 rooms in Finsbury, where their landlady was disturbed by the fact that Krupskaya wore no wedding ring. Among those who met Lenin at this time was a girl of 17, now Mrs. Zelda Coates.
Well, I first met Lenin at my sister's house, and the first impression I had of him was that he was a rather short, stocky man with very expressive eyes, almost bald, he was, so far as I remember, and his hair was very pale, well, almost reddish. My sister had several children, and what struck me also was how very friendly he was with the children. He seemed to, he not only sort of patted them down and that sort of thing like one does with a child, but he entered into their spirit. He started playing with them and had a game with them, and his shouting and laughter was practically as loud and as merry as those of the children themselves.
For Lenin, even the Times had its revolutionary uses. Under the name of Richter, he advertised language lessons. He needed the money for Iskra. The paper was produced from a small printing shop in Clerkenwell Green, in the shadow of the parish church. Here they often worked late into the night, correcting proofs. Lenin, Krupskaya, and a handful of other Russian revolutionaries. Lenin liked to study London from the top of a bus and follow the path of his revolutionary forebears, Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. He liked the bustle of the vast commercial city. He also appreciated the quiet London squares with their neat houses and separate entrances and shiny windows. But he never failed to contrast luxury with the misery just around the corner, the mean streets and homes of the working class. In 1903, the Russian Marxists met in a drab London hall, and it was now that the future of the Russian Marxist movement was decided. The party was split down the middle. Lenin's opponents wanted to give party membership to every willing helper. The more widely the title of member of the party was spread, the better. Lenin's group was determined that party membership should only be given to a hard core of enthusiasts, the most dedicated. Lenin's group won by 2 votes. They became the Bolsheviks, the majority. The losers were the Mensheviks, the minority.
And there was a fierce discussion as to the tactics to be pursued in Russia at that time. Well, it was soon after the revolutionary events in Russia, and most of the Mensheviks present at that particular gathering, they said, let us have a period of rest now. Let workers are tired out. We must not drive them too hard. And now Lenin, on the contrary, he jumped up from his chair in a rather furious mood, which was a little bit out of the common so far as I knew him at the time, and said, that's all nonsense. It's you, messieurs Mensheviks, who are tired. The working class in Russia are not tired, on the contrary. They are full of energy, they are full of desire to fight for their freedom and for the overthrow of Tsardom.
The Tsar himself seemed oblivious of the events which were to decide the fate of his throne, his family, and his country. The date was 1904, and Nicholas was waging a war with Japan to satisfy some dubious territorial ambition. But the formal life of the court continued undisturbed. Far away from this elaborate ceremonial, the Russian armies endured successive defeats and then surrendered to the Japanese at Port Arthur. Lenin, of course, gave an analysis. It was not the Russian people that had suffered defeat. It was the autocracy. The capitulation was only a prelude to the capitulation of the Tsar. In St. Petersburg, news of the humiliations of the war was followed by the iron cold of January. It had become a winter of discontent. On Sunday, January the 9th, 200,000 people marched to the Winter Palace to present a petition to the Tsar. They were all unarmed, and many of them chanted, "God save the Tsar." Their requests for better working conditions were modest, but Nicholas refused to accept their petition. The day is known as Bloody Sunday. Over 1,000 of the marchers were killed, and 5,000 were wounded, many of them women and children. But the Tsar found time to write up his diary as usual. It was a hard day. In St. Petersburg, serious disturbances occurred because the workers wanted to come to the Winter Palace. The troops had to fire on them, and there were many killed and wounded. My God, how it hurts me, and it was hard to witness. Mother came for lunch, which we all ate together. Then I took Michael for a walk. Lenin was in Geneva when the first reports of Bloody Sunday reached the outside world. He was on his way to the library with Krupskaya when he heard the news. And at once they changed their plans and rushed to an emigre cafe where they found their excited Bolshevik friends reading the latest editions of the Swiss papers. Lenin now saw his dreams of a revolution within reach. He said there must be an armed uprising, an immediate armed uprising, and any talk of failure was the talk of cowards. In preparation, he applied himself to the grim techniques of civil warfare. This particular volume, The Memoirs of Russian Revolutionaries of the 19th Century, still contains his notes on the margins of its pages. In St. Petersburg in October 1905, representatives of the city's workers met for the first time. They called themselves a council. The Russian word is Soviet. And one of their first decisions was to call a general strike. By the end of October, St. Petersburg was at a standstill. With 3 million workers on strike, the Tsar was forced for the first time to make concessions. And he now promised free elections to a national assembly. But the strikers were stubbornly determined to hold out, and their leaders called for an end to the monarchy. In Moscow, barricades were erected on the streets by the Bolshevik fighting brigades and by hundreds of strikers. The Tsar stated the situation was intolerable, sent for his Minister of the Interior, and ordered him to take all measures he considered necessary. The year 1905, which had begun with Bloody Sunday, ended with yet another public slaughter. The power of the Tsar seemed once again to be unchallenged, and the leaders of the Soviet were exiled. The name of its last chairman, a socialist but not yet a Bolshevik, was Leon Trotsky. 3 months later, the promised National Assembly met for the first time. Lenin attacked it from exile. He insisted that the assembly was an instrument unsuitable for realizing the victory of the revolution, his whole concern. And he claimed the Russian government remained a military despotism embellished with parliamentary forms. The Tsar summoned and dissolved the assembly as he chose, and once noted in his diary, "Today I dissolved the National Assembly. The weather was wonderful. I read a book and took a boat trip." This was the age of oppression, and the police files of the period recorded the names of many who were to play their parts in the October Revolution of 1917. Deryunsky, Joseph Stalin. More than 5,000 executions took place, and 40,000 political prisoners died in jail. Tens of thousands more were condemned to penal servitude in Siberia. One of them was Michael Lebedev.
You're just a thing, they used to tell us. You belong to me, and I'll do what I like with you. I feed you if I feel like it, with anything that's around. And if I don't feel like it, you starve. You'll not get anything. We were kept in cells that must have been built for anything from 40 to 45 people. And the food, that muck wasn't food at all. We used to call it pig swill. It was just water with a few scraps. And God knows what they were. And that was all. Well, so what? After all, a prison's a prison. All human feeling is utterly repressed by it.
In St. Petersburg, society life went on as usual, and the daughters of the well-to-do went about their charitable tasks. For the Russians are a very generous people. Other daughters went to finishing school and learned the graceful requirements of the leisured life. This famous academy was known as the Smolny Institute, and it was from this very building that Lenin would announce the Bolshevik victory in 1917. The fuse was ignited again in 1912 in the Lena goldfield in Siberia. The miners were threatened by a pay cut and went out on strike. Michael Lebedev was one of them.
They were waiting for a good moment to fire. Suddenly there was a noise like the ripping of canvas. This must have been the first volley. I listened. There was a second. The workers began to shout, and then suddenly everyone fell down. I fell too. And as I fell, I saw Danilov next to me, lying somehow strangely on his back, staring at me. And then I saw a black worm crawl out from behind his ear. I realized it was blood. It was no joke. They were really shooting. Then another volley, and another. Then silence.
Lenin moved to Poland after the incident at Lena so that he could be closer to events at home. It was another quiet interlude. Every day, after a supper of soup and meatballs, he would finish off his article for Pravda and take it to the post office. He and Krupskaya lived in a small, closely knit circle of comrades. Their friends used to visit, take walks with them. The group was nicknamed the Hikers' Party. They went to concerts. Lenin dearly loved music. The peace and order of their country life made a strange contrast with the revolutionary passion of Lenin's thought. He was as fervent as ever, claiming the age of bourgeois democracy was nearly over. Soon it would give way to the age of revolution. Soon the working classes would overthrow the bourgeoisie and establish communism. 500 miles away in the Balkan town of Sarajevo, the people were celebrating an annexation of some Yugoslavian territory. Austrian Archduke Franz Ferdinand was paying a state visit. Waiting in the crowd was a young Yugoslav with a pistol. Europe was soon at war.